Hi, Chip Dornell ahead on the left. Fake news can mean a lot of things. It can be anything from the weekend update segment on Saturday Night Live to the grocery store tabloids. But for the sake of this, we're going to be talking about fake news as it pertains to politics. And in 2016, BuzzFeed published a fascinating article. And in that article, they profiled this tiny village in Macedonia where young teens were creating these websites, about 140 or so, all with content about the American election. Now, the Macedonian economy isn't very good. Teens weren't allowed to work, but they still wanted to make a buck. So they created these websites. And what they would do was take content from American websites and repackage it as their own. Now, what BuzzFeed also found was that the majority of these 140 or so websites were pro-Trump, anti-Clinton, and that the best performing articles coming out of these websites were either false or misleading. Now remember, these teens weren't political at all. They were just trying to make a buck, and they were trying to sell what got the most clicks. And what got the most clicks was fake news directed to conservative readers. I know, how liberal of me. How dare I use the free market to prove a point? So where did all this news fakery begin? In a previous video, I talked about the emergence of the so-called culture war. And the culture war was how right-wing conservatives described their opposition to the groups, issues, and people that they detested.
This is radical feminism, the agenda that Clinton and Clinton would impose on America. Abortion on demand, a litmus test for the Supreme Court, homosexual rights, discrimination against religious schools, women in combat units. It is a cultural war as critical to the kind of nation we shall be as the Cold War itself, for this war is for the soul of America.
Now you get a sense there of a simmering rage, and rage is not rational, and that will affect your relationship to reality, and that is where Rush Limbaugh came in. Before Rush Limbaugh, conservative media personalities were sort of white collar. You had your Fred Barneses, you had your George Willses, you had your Charles Krauthammerses. And while you may disagree with those guys, none of them were the kind of person who would call feminists feminazis, and none of them would call the young daughter of a sitting president the White House dog. But Rush Limbaugh did. And with that rage-inspired crudeness, he became the #1 radio personality in America. Now, conspiracy theories and hoaxes and lies have existed in politics forever, but they were usually on the fringe. But what Rush Limbaugh did was take those fringe conspiracy theories, hoaxes, and lies that suited his agenda and brought them to a more now mainstream conservative audience. So when the Clintons moved into the White House, Limbaugh spent hours per day trying to link the Clintons to virtually every death in Arkansas. And in 1993, when Deputy White House Counsel Vince Foster committed suicide in Fort Marcy Park, Limbaugh spent even more hours on the radio suggesting that the Clintons had Foster killed and then moved his body and had it staged to make it look like it was a suicide. Now bear in mind, when the Starr report came out 5 years later in 1998, it wasn't good for Bill Clinton. He did get impeached from what was inside the report. But one thing the Starr report did do was conclude that Vince Foster's death was a suicide. So did that stop Rush Limbaugh from suggesting the Clintons had him killed? Oh, absolutely not. To this day, Fort Marcy Park is code to Rush Limbaugh's listeners that the Clintons have people killed. Fake news, fake news, fake news. Based on Rush Limbaugh's success, other conservative people went into media following his same model. And many of them were not journalists either, and even if they were journalists, they were using the model of conspiracy theories and lies because this is what the audience had become accustomed to. And as a result, throughout the 1990s, trust in the mainstream media among people who considered themselves conservative dropped off. So they actually started to grow hostile towards professional journalists while cultivating an adoration for people like Rush Limbaugh and his peers who were conspiracy theorists and liars. So why the attraction to conspiracy theorists and liars? Because the conspiracy theorists and liars were telling them what they wanted to hear. Fake news. Throughout the same period, trust in media among people who considered themselves more liberal remained about the same. So they were still getting their news from professional journalists in the mainstream media. So when your liberal friend goes on Facebook and complains about what they just watched on CNN, they were still just watching CNN. Now that doesn't mean there's no such thing as liberal conspiracy theories or liberal fake news. There was some liberal fake news in the 2016 election with the intention mainly of drawing a bigger wedge between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. But if you think about it, there is not the same apparatus on the left for disseminating left-wing conspiracy theories as you have on the right that was established by Rush Limbaugh and then continued with his conservative peers. So when one of your friends tells you, it's both sides, it happens on both sides, make them prove it. There is no liberal equivalent of Rush Limbaugh. There is no liberal equivalent of Fox and Friends, and there is no liberal equivalent of Alex Jones. It's not both sides. But don't take my word for it, just ask a Macedonian teen. Which story do you think would get more clicks? Donald Trump is gay or Hillary Clinton is a lesbian?
But what is your advice to Americans who are addicted to fake news?
It is an addiction.
Because it makes you feel good, right?
Yeah, well, it makes you feel good to read what you want to read, to read everything that agrees with you. And everything is, oh, Trump, love Trump, love Obama bad, Hillary Clinton, lock her up, Trump. I mean, I guess that's like that.